And thank you, Anna, for starting us off with such a rich talk. I think I need to begin with two caveats. The first one is sort of vaguely bibliographical, and that is that I am currently on the city campus of the University of Newcastle because I was filming some online learning videos in our letterpress studio. So I booked myself a Zoom room. I thought I was being very diligent, and it turns out that I'm in the Pro Vice Chancellor's suite. So if someone comes in, it could be the Pro Vice Chancellor of a different faculty. So if I abruptly turn to my left, someone has entered. So I apologize. It's a very 2020 issue. The second caveat is also, I guess, kind of a 2020 issue, which is that I think Shakespeare plays less of a role in this paper than I had originally imagined. It's drawn from a bigger project that I am about to embark upon, and the Shakespeare piece has not sort of come together as well as I had hoped. But I think what I have today will be an interesting topic for discussion anyway. One seminar series I contributed to early in the pandemic had what they called fireside chats. So maybe it's helpful to think of this as a fireside chat or perhaps a harborside chat. So with those small warnings out of the way, I will begin. The importance of manuscript evidence is now widely recognized in studies of early modern English literature. In the decades since the publication of Peter Beal's landmark Index of Literary Manuscripts, scholars have offered overviews of private manuscript circulation and scribal publication. So here I'm thinking of people like Henry Woodhuizen or Harold Love, studies of literary genres like Arthur Marotti or Joshua Eckart, material forms, things like studies of manuscript miscellanies, of material letters, and so on, and revisionist histories that include a more diverse range of historical agents. And here I'm thinking of the work of Victoria Burke or Margaret Ezell. Manuscripts have also informed new editions and studies of canonical authors. In particular, we've seen a lot of energy around John Donne, whose poems survive in more contemporary copies than those of any other early modern author, and also from kind of people writing from the margins. So women, people from kind of different class backgrounds, and increasingly people from kind of outside what we'd think of as an early modern English mainstream. Peter Beal himself continued to produce important scholarship from the index on, including works like A Dictionary of English Manuscript Terminology in 2008, and the online Catalogue of English Literary Manuscripts, or CELM, which is absolutely invaluable to me. But despite this flourishing of the field, I think that we are still lacking a comprehensive method for dealing with early modern manuscripts, which in turn leads scholars that are new to early modern manuscripts to try to induce principles for working with these manuscripts from either scholarship on earlier periods or to adapt concepts from print bibliography. Methods for printed books are an uneasy fit for manuscripts, though. And classic works of Anglo-American bibliography make few, if any, direct references to manuscript. The most influential early 20th century bibliographers and textual theorists, including W.W. Gregg, Fredson Bowers, R.B. McKerrow, and their kind of immediate circle, were largely motivated by a desire to recover William Shakespeare's intended texts of his plays. Because Shakespeare left very few manuscripts, the so-called new bibliographers did not offer much guidance for working with manuscripts in their foundational studies. The index of McKerrow's An Introduction to Bibliography for Literary Students includes only 2 entries for manuscripts. The first is, quote, whether destroyed when printed, and the second is few surviving after use. So we don't have a lot of proactive information about what to do if you actually do encounter a manuscript. Fredson Bowers' Principles of Bibliographical Description includes no references to manuscript, though Bowers did offer some thoughts about transcribing manuscripts, mostly 19th and 20th century American material in a Studies in Bibliography article in 1976. I had hoped to say a bit more about these gaps, especially because these men were skilled paleographers and were certainly equipped to comment on manuscripts if that's what they wanted to do. There's an interesting story to be told, I think, about how this omission, which is grounded in a very particular kind of scholarly agenda, kind of inadvertently, I think, came to shape both the field of bibliography and the remit of early modern studies for decades. But as I said, this research is kind of, it's the beginning of a much bigger project that hasn't quite come together in 2020. You know, there's some other stuff happening. And partly because I'm still trying to wrap up my last project on women's writing in manuscript miscellany. So I think instead of trying to fumble my way through this still incomplete work on the new bibliographers, I think the best thing to do at this moment today is to kind of lay out what I've done so far, as well as the things that I hope to do, and then open things up for discussion. And so I'll try to keep things relatively brief, and I'll look forward to hearing any thoughts you might have, especially if you're keen to collaborate. I was very excited to see that Anna has been using VizCall, which is high on my list. So I think it's safe to say that Greg, Bowers, and McKerrow set the direction of early 20th century bibliographical studies, with Shakespeare sort of firmly, centered. So it would follow quite naturally that manuscripts would possibly be pushed to the side a bit. Following the 1958 publication of Lucien Febvre and Henri-Jean Martin's L'apparition du livre, first translated into English in 1976, an emerging group of book historians increasingly turned to non-authorial agents in their intentions. So this included manuscript compilers, but it still didn't really have them at the center. However, many of these early studies were still treating manuscripts, even when they were addressed, as mere precursors to printed books that were then made obsolete by this arrival of print culture, which is a teleology that I think since Beal came onto the scene in the 80s, we've really started to resist, that manuscript and print came to serve different purposes, but that one didn't necessarily supersede the other. But the intellectual and material barriers to studying manuscripts have remained, even as detailed technical studies of print and of the book trade have become a very mainstream part of early modern studies. So it's not uncommon now to see compositor analysis, for example, in an early modern paper, but it's less likely that you'll see the sort of detailed collation that Anna offered, for example. And so I'm kind of trying to find solutions for how we might bring that technical knowledge to a wider group of scholars. I'm not the first to do this kind of work. Scholars have long called for the development of bibliographical methods for early modern manuscripts. Henry Woodhuizen was first in 1996 to say, we need our Bowers and McKerrow. And as recently as 2008, Noel J. Kinnaman observed, and I'm quoting here, "The varied, complex, and often unique character of early modern manuscripts would make such a project extraordinarily challenging." So part of what I'm interested in doing over the next several years is thinking about how we might overcome these challenges, particularly by using digital tools. Because I think at the end of the day, the methods for printed books that we've been trying to adapt to fit with manuscript are kind of an uneasy fit. And I see at least three interrelated reasons for this. First, I love how our papers have kind of dovetailed really nicely. First, there's the increasing availability of affordable rag paper, which just opens up the possibility of writing to so many more people. Second, the maturation of print in the book trade, which is also sort of increasing the number of texts that are available in the world to be copied into manuscript. And finally, kind of simultaneous increases in literacy and writing. While medieval manuscripts were written on expensive animal-based materials like vellum and parchment, relatively affordable paper made from linen rags was more readily available in the early modern period. And this in turn allowed for the growth of the commercial book trade and stimulated new forms of manuscript record keeping, archiving, correspondence, note-taking, and life writing. Rather than replacing manuscript circulation, print facilitated both the wider adoption of existing textual practices like commonplacing or excerpting pithy or useful phrases for reuse, and the development of new ones, like the printing of blank forms that were then completed by hand. And Peter Stallybrass has done a lot of work on this. Consequently, early modern manuscripts offer rich and detailed, but also unusually complex glimpses into the English-speaking world during the 16th and 17th centuries. There have been some efforts to propose standards for discrete elements of early modern manuscripts. Harold Love proposed a system of sorry, this is a bit of a tongue twister, a system of standardized sigla akin to those used by biblical scholars and musicologists. This was in 2011. And David Vandermeulen and Thomas Tansell have offered some principles for manuscript transcription. However, these efforts have been fairly local in their scope, and they have not been widely adopted. Beal's invaluable dictionary glosses an extensive technical vocabulary, but its alphabetical organization requires readers to have some basic knowledge of manuscripts and manuscript culture in order to know which headings to consult. There are also resources that are created more for librarians and catalogers, including Gregory Pass's descriptive cataloging of ancient, medieval, Renaissance, and early modern manuscripts. But this focuses largely, though not exclusively, on pre-modern scribally produced manuscripts. The more recent comprehensive descriptive cataloging of rare materials manuscripts kind of has a wider remit, but both of these guides are intended primarily as references for trained catalogers, documenting a repository's holdings. So they're less useful for scholars attempting to interpret or describe physical evidence, particularly new users of manuscripts, your postgraduate students or someone who's maybe pivoting from doing research on print into manuscript. So while robust methods exist for earlier documents, particularly early medieval, or sorry, not early medieval, just all medieval English manuscripts. So we have, sorry, I'm gonna back up. We have these robust methods for somewhat earlier materials in English, including codicology, so addressing the physical structure of manuscripts, paleography, which of course we have for early modern studies, but guiding the interpretation of handwriting, diplomatics, just the study of documents, and epigraphy, or the study of writing on buildings and objects. But we just don't have the robust methods for early modern English manuscripts yet. And this is particularly striking when one looks to sort of continental traditions. We have more robust guidelines for other national and linguistic traditions in the same time period. The Manus database, for example, catalogs and describes early modern Italian manuscripts. So what I am proposing and what I hope to achieve over the coming years is an extensible methodology for English manuscripts that would eventually allow for some degree of, if not international harmonization of these standards, at least a shared vocabulary so that we can try to communicate with each other. Because of course, none of these manuscripts stayed in the country where they were produced. Maybe some stayed physically, but there was so much exchange in the period that I think we as scholars need to try to think in a more transnational context. We also have a sort of secondary either problem or opportunity in this field, insofar as libraries and archives have actually made great strides in digitizing their collections, and also increasingly allows self-service digital photography. And this in turn heightens the urgency of this gap in methods, I think. Suddenly there are many more images of manuscripts available, but people still don't necessarily know what they're looking at. So because manuscripts are unique, the digitization of manuscripts may seem to some to, I guess, yield a smaller marginal return, where a digital facsimile of a printed book is often wrongly assumed to stand in for an entire edition, which obviously Thomas Tansell and others have sort of really shown is not accurate. This can nevertheless be used as an argument against digitizing individual manuscripts. And as a consequence, there have been fewer efforts to create anything like an early English books online for manuscripts.
That's 10 minutes. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I think that'll be perfect. So the Folger Shakespeare's Library's recent Early Modern Manuscripts Online, or EMO project, is a really notable exception as it aims to make digitizations and crowdsourced transcriptions widely available. And the beta version that's currently available provides high resolution digital images, as well as 3 different transcriptions of each document it includes. But only a very small fraction of the Folger's manuscript collection is represented so far. And the site offers only limited information about the physical documents that are photographed and transcribed. It's much more invested in kind of making the content accessible. So that initiative has been reframed as part of a larger project. And it'll be interesting to see where it goes as the Miranda digital asset platform sort of takes off. But at the same time, mass digitization is arguably, this might be a little provocative, arguably less necessary now than it might have been before because of this increase in self-service photography. It doesn't obviate disparities in institutional resources and travel funding, but I think we've seen through the lockdown with the hashtag lockdown library, social media and other electronic forms of communication have made it easy to obtain reliable images quickly and at minimal expense, if possibly in an ethically dubious fashion. These images, like those from earlier imaging efforts, reproduce some features of the original documents and are undoubtedly valuable for reference, but they're also distinct artifacts in a different medium with its own affordances and its own limitations. So their physical instantiations remain invisible unless they're accompanied by comprehensive and accurate metadata. And even then, that's still a representation of the physical object. It's not the thing itself. But a fuller account of the production and circulation of manuscripts created after the introduction of print will allow for the creation and interpretation of this metadata. And it will give scholars a vocabulary to describe and interpret manuscripts and facsimiles of them, regardless of their source. While neither digital images nor descriptions can replace the documents themselves, a systematic bibliographical approach will allow users to ultimately use the original documents more effectively. So there are a lot of really impressive projects happening right now. I've made a list, but I think I will not work my way through it as part of this talk in the interest of time. I just kind of wanted to flag the archetype environment at the King's Digital Lab and Transcribus as 2 particularly promising technologies, along with VisCall, that I think can help us start to get at the sort of manuscriptness of these documents in a digital space. But I just want to conclude so that we do have some time for questions. Again, I'm kind of at the very early stages of this project of trying to develop and model evidence-based principles for the description of early modern manuscripts, particularly by kind of trying to apply these technologies and sort of seeing where they break, where the OCR can't handle unique early modern hands, or where VisCall is just like, what do you do with the random sheets that someone has pinned into the front of their miscellany? And I think that if we can get a handle on a descriptive vocabulary, this would, or maybe not a vocabulary, the vocabulary exists, but I guess a more comprehensive method to do so would offer new ways of understanding and using the historical evidence that manuscripts contain. It would allow us to kind of analyze and describe books in a way that can be extended in time and across national and disciplinary boundaries, and perhaps in relation to print culture insofar as it influences manuscript culture, while not trying to cram manuscript documents into kind of print categories. So in other words, taking manuscripts seriously as a complementary and even competing medium. Ultimately, I think this would allow us to challenge teleological narratives about so-called media shifts, including contemporary accounts of the balance between print, digital, and manuscript communications. And so with that in mind, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. If any of you medieval manuscript experts want to help me out, I would be especially grateful. So thanks again. Thank you.